By the way, I thought you might like to know you've now set a record for number of tickets booked.
Really?
Yep. You've nearly doubled our normal number.
That's really cool.
Yeah. And I've just been reminded by someone in the other room that yes, all of our attendees can hear this. I was aware of that. I'm fine with that.
Hi, everyone.
Okay. So I will give it a couple of minutes. And then we'll start with the intro and go from there. Did you manage to get your botanical gin sorted?
I did, yes. It's
Good.
right there. Even got myself a lemon for it.
Apparently the mint mojito was drunk early, but
Accidentally drank the mint mojito. Love it.
these things happen.
Yeah.
Right, so welcome everyone. I'm sure we'll have a few more dropping in, but I'll get started with the explanation while we're waiting. This is our Cafe Sci for today with Bethany Nichols, PhD student and plant-obsessed botanist, who's got a scary amount of information on plants and which ones are and are not flowers, which I didn't find quite as mind-blowing as some, but was still really confusing. So I'm looking forward to this as much as hopefully all of you are. Just a quick run through. Normally, Cafe Sci, we would hold in a wine bar or something similar. That's not really an option at the moment. So we do encourage you to have a drink, whether it's alcoholic or not, that's entirely your choice, but something just to relax with while you listen to the speaker. We do try to make these sessions as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions, just drop them in the Q&A or in the chat panel, and I will rudely interrupt Bethany to ask them or to ask her to pause while I unmute you so you can ask them. If there's any questions asked, one option you've got is raise hands button, which should be down at the bottom. And if you'd like me to just chat to you quickly, if you raise your hand, I'll send you a private message. So if you've got any technical problems or any non-topical questions, I'm happy to take those up and talk them through with you while Bethany's busy entertaining you all. So with that, let me put you in the spotlight. And it's all yours.
Great. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you very much for that introduction. It's very nice. Yeah, so as James said, my name is Bethany Nichols. I'm a PhD student at Royal Holloway, University of London, and I have just started a blog as well. So if you find any of this interesting, there'll be details about that at the end. I have forgotten how to share my screen. Ah, here it is. So, share. Oh no, hold on. It's now doing something. Sorry, technical difficulties.
Technical difficulties are a tradition, so that's fine. You've not got a phone vibrating its way across the table, so you're ahead of the game. And just while you're doing that, for anyone interested in the blog, it does make great reading, and I've just put the URL in chat, and I'll put it in the description later when this goes on demand.
Great. Sure. Is that working? Can you see
it is, yes.
Okay, great. Fabulous. Okay, sorry about that, everybody. We are up and running now. So welcome to my talk. I've given this only once before at a sixth form college, and they decided they were converts to botany afterwards. So hopefully I'll get the same reaction from you guys too. So my talk is going to be on plants and the five senses, but very quickly I just want to introduce you to a little bit about myself and what I do. So here you can see a Instagram style expectation versus reality picture. I am a botanist, but I'm currently working in computer science. So on the left, you can see this is Ationema arabicum, which is the plant that I would love to be in the field in Turkey working with every day. But unfortunately, my scene normally looks like the picture on the right, which is my little setup at my desk, which is where we are today. But you can see my nephew's nose just poking in. If you can see my mouth, this is Monty. He decided to jump into this one. So this is normally what my setup looks like. I, as a computational botanist, what I do is I take plant life behaviors and I simulate them on the computer, and using that I can very quickly see through running through a succession of simulations how certain environmental changes, climate change or just natural everyday changes, will affect a plant population over the years. So using this information, we can get quite a good view of what's going to happen in the future based on experiences of plants that we take from the field. So I can take empirical evidence and use that to build my models to increase their validity and things like that. But specifically today, I'm going to be talking about the 5 senses and comparing them to what plants are able to experience. So the 5 senses, you might think these are the ones that are familiar. You've got sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. And these ones are not the only senses that you have, but these are the Aristotelian senses, and these are what we typically think of as the main 5. In reality, there are lots of things that we can also sense. We can also sense balance. We've got specialized instruments in our ears for sensing balance. We can sense temperature, pain. There are animals and plants that can sense all kinds of other things, magnetism, electric fields, things like that. But going back, I just want to focus on these 5 for the sake of simplicity, but also to just begin your journey into plant sensing. We're going to go back to the original 5, and at the end I'm also going to introduce you to temperature, because that's the sense that I'm currently really interested in for my PhD. So we'll start with something that I think might not be a huge shock to all of you, which is that plants can sense touch. So a great example of this is Arabidopsis thaliana, which is well known in the science community as kind of the model plant that all other plants kind of get compared to. Generally, when we build a model for a plant system, we'll look first at Arabidopsis because it's taken as the model system for botany. And a paper by Apple and Cocroft in 2014 on this was able to demonstrate that these plants are able to sense touch. So they recorded the acoustic vibrations created by a caterpillar eating Arabidopsis thaliana, and they played this. They vibrated a leaf in the same pattern as they would do, as it would receive from a caterpillar eating it, and they found that it produced the exact same chemical reaction as it would do if it was actually being eaten by that caterpillar. So it can sense the caterpillar eating it, essentially. And they did this with, they tested this with a number of other vibrations, the sound of the feeling of something walking across it, and nothing else produced the same response as the sensation of being chewed. And I want to take this a step further and say that, in fact, there are some plants that, in response to being touched, so in this example, the response that they have is they produce these chemicals, and the reason they do this, oh, I just called Siri. Siri thought that was me speaking to it, sorry. The response that it gives is that it produces these chemicals, and they are designed to deter something from continuing to eat it. So yeah, so it's a very simple little system, but when you play other sounds to it, nothing else happens. Taking this further, when plants are being eaten, some of them can produce a very high-pitched scream almost. It's a very high-pitched noise that something like a mouse can hear, but it's not something that we can hear. So if you're walking through a field and something is nibbling on a plant below you, you're not going to hear the blood-curdling screams coming from it. But if you were a mouse, for example, you might have the hearing range to be able to hear things being eaten around you. So I think that's just a small testament to the sorts of things plants can do. Why would they be able to do that? I don't know, they like being able to tell each other when things are going on. So to let their kin know that they're being eaten, so they can start to put up their own defenses in preparation for that caterpillar getting tired of being eaten and something else, and it moving on to something else to eat that. So staying on the theme of vibrations, we're going to move from Arabidopsis onto evening primrose now. And there's been a very recent study on evening primrose that suggests that it can hear. So this flower that you see before you is able to hear the sound of a bee buzzing and coming towards it and start to produce nectar in response. So this process takes about 3 minutes and this is a study conducted by Weitz in 2018. And they showed that if you play the sound of a pollinator to an evening primrose, it starts to produce nectar within 3 minutes. If you play something else to it, like the wind or other pollination noises, nothing happens. So it's a very specified evolution that it can hear the bees coming and then produce nectar in response. So this is a good way to increase cross-pollination, for example. So if it can hear a bee pollinating a plant in the distance, then it starts producing nectar in preparation for a bee coming to pollinate it. So increasing the chance of cross-pollination, increasing the chance of it going on to reproduce. So you have to humour me with this one, but with taste and smell, I'm going to group them together as the same thing. And the reason I'm doing this is because taste and smell are essentially very similar processes, especially in us. So it's the intake of chemicals into a sensor, either on the tongue or at the back of the nose. And they're so combined in humans that without one, it's difficult to do the other. So for example, if you haven't had your dinner yet, tonight, if you take the first bite of your dinner whilst holding your nose, you should be able to find that you can't taste it as well as you normally would. It's quite common in people who have accidents involving their nose to be able to, they stop being able to taste. The two are very interconnected. Your taste relies very heavily on smell. So for the sake of simplicity for plants, I'm going to say that taste and smell are almost synonymous, and give you an example of a Douglas fir being able to taste and smell. And this is a bit of a rabbit hole story because it's something that once you start digging into, you're going to find yourself in a little bit of an otherworldly experience. So Susan Simard gave this amazing TED talk, not sure when it was a good couple of years ago now, but I remember watching it and just becoming completely overwhelmed. She kind of takes you into this complete avatar world where trees are able to talk and sense and interact with one another, and these big forest networks appear, and it's all very AWA. It's wonderful, it's really beautiful, and I would absolutely recommend her TED talk to you if you are interested in finding out more. But what these trees are able to do is they have mycorrhizal networks, which are, so in their roots, they have these fungi, and the fungi are involved in nutrient uptake and resource management, things like that. And we thought that this was just down to individual trees, but it turns out that what they're able to do is take a mother tree it will disperse its seeds. They go down to the ground, they germinate. As they're growing and producing their roots, the mother tree roots grow under the soil and they go out into the local environment, and they're able to sniff at the roots growing around them, and they can recognize their kin growing in their local vicinity. What they then do is they join their roots with their kin, and they send the funguses growing on their roots. It's a symbiotic relationship. So they send those funguses down their roots to their offspring roots, so that they start to then have that mycorrhizal network build up as well. And this is truly amazing. They have recently found it's not just between trees and their kin. Some trees have a symbiotic relationship with each other, and they send off their mycorrhizal network to another tree species mycorrhizal network, and it becomes this whole under forest network of roots and funguses communicating and interacting with each other. And you might think to yourself, what purpose would a tree have for being able to build up this network? Like, what would the purpose be for that? And there are two great reasons that seem to be the biggest. I think there are lots of reasons out there, but the two that I keep reading about and finding out more about is resource management and I've forgotten the word for it. Protection. It'll come to me in a minute. So resource management is defense mechanisms. That's the one. So resource management, if a tree produces a surplus of carbon or something, as an example, it will send the excess carbon through these mycorrhizal networks to its offspring and to the trees in its environment to promote their growth. Equally, in terms of defense networks, if a tree is injured in some way, if you injure one of these trees, it sends a chemical signal to the trees around it to say, I've been injured, and they start to put up their defense mechanisms. So these trees are able to distribute their wealth between each other to make sure that their kin are growing nice and strong, that those around them are growing nice and strong. And it builds this wonderful community of them talking and interacting, supplying for each other, and making sure that everybody is kind of okay, which is really Avatar, and I absolutely love it. And they not only do this, but I'll put this as an add-on. I didn't know where this would fit, but I just think this is the coolest thing. Trees also produce their own signature sound. So this is now a little bit Lord of the Rings, a little bit Ents talking to each other, but I know what you're thinking. What does a tree sound like? I hope that my sound is gonna come through. You have to let me know if it doesn't, but this is the sound a Scots pine makes. If it will load. Is it not going to? Let's try this browser. Is this coming through? So, pretty weird. To me, it sounds like someone open-mouthed chewing, so I don't like it. But all acoustic emissions from trees are unique to that species. So what could they be saying to each other? Does it actually mean anything? We don't know. But the acoustic sounds do change when they're under stress, for example. So there could be something in it, but this is all very new research. Who knows what we'll find out in the next couple of years. We might find out that there really are Ents and they are all talking to each other and whispering things. But yeah, it could be another way for them to communicate defense or something about, you know, the weather's nice today. I don't know. That remains to be seen. So yes, this is Susan Samad, who has done fabulous work on this area. And I will say this again, if you can find her TED Talk, I'll actually link it on my Twitter later as well. So if you want to if you want a direct link to it, I'll pop this on my Twitter after the talk. Absolutely would recommend. It's really good. Okay, so moving on to sight. This one, I think you guys should be fairly familiar with this, but just in case, plants can detect light, and that shouldn't be a complete shock. They can detect light. Not only that, but they can detect the direction that the light is coming from. So a really good example of this is sunflowers. They can detect the direction of light, and their flowers actually move across the sky to, where's my mouse gone? Here it is. To follow the light to make sure that they maximize their light.
I'm just going to butt in with a question, going back to the sound,
Okay.
which is, how is the sound produced, or where is it produced?
Fabulous question. The sound is produced by pushing water through the water and sugars through the xylem and phloem tubes. They seem to think that it is more through the sieves in the phloem that produces that really distinct crackling sound. The xylem as well, the water pressure going through that. So it's almost like they're using the xylem and phloem like vocal cords pushing, but instead of it pushing air through the cords, it's pushing water and or substrate through their transport vessels. So yeah, it's mind-blowing to me, really. So yeah, okay. So sorry, does that answer your question, James?
Wasn't my question, but I think it does answer it.
Okay,
and now that I've thrown you off, I'll let you get back to it.
Thanks. So sunflowers. Yes, traveling across the sky following the light source. So as the sun rises and sunsets, you can see that the sunflower will move its position in response to the light. And then at night, they go back, and then they can start the whole process again. And this is really interesting, because what they do is, as this isn't a permanent state, obviously, we know that plants grow in a certain direction according to light. So if you grow something that's going to be quite long and straight, like a mother of thousands, for example, if you spin the pot, you can get the plant to grow in different directions. So you can get the plant to kind of spiral. This isn't a permanent movement. This is about the turgidity of the cells. So the cells in the stem become more turgid on one side than the other in response to the direction of light, so that then it pushes the stem one side or the other. And what happens at the end of the day is there's no light, so the cells go flaccid, and then the stem returns to its original position.
I'm going to throw you off again with another couple of questions that have come in.
Okay, great.
One of them's on the sound, and it was from Avril wondering earlier how plants screamed, which sounds different to the movement of fluids through the xylem and phloem.
That is that is different. I actually don't know the answer to that question. What part of it that produces that high-pitched scream? Yeah, it wasn't clear from the paper that I was reading. I would have to find that out, and I would have to contact you later about that one, I'm afraid. Do you have another? Did you say a couple of questions?
Yep, the other one was, would they follow in artificial light in the same way?
Yes, depending on the light. So if you grow, so there's lots of different types of light, and plants can actually sense different types of light. They have different chemical and defense responses to things like infrared and ultraviolet. So plants can sense all sorts of different lighting. If you grow a plant in something like a greenhouse, you can get it to follow a light in the same way. In sort of our big lab greenhouses, you get a flat light, so the light tends to just be dispersed everywhere, and so you don't see this behavior in sunflowers that are kept in artificial lighting from like a direct light source above them. But if you were to mimic that in a lab, then it would do that too.
Thank you. And then we've got another one just coming in. Is the sunflower's neutral position upright, or do they go all the way back to where they need to be in the morning?
All the way back to, so you can see here, all the way back to where they need to be in the morning. So to some extent, they will have grown in that direction. That is what plants tend to do, is they tend to grow in the direction of the light. So what happens is the growing process will start at the beginning of the day, because plants have also got a circadian rhythm in the same way that we have. Well, not in the same way that we have, but in a similar way, in that the day starts, the sun comes up, and they start growing. So their natural initial growth spurt will be in the direction of light. So they will be slightly biased to one side, and then they'll go away, watch towards the light, and then at the end of the day, they will return back. So you can see the sunflower is at the same position as it was at the beginning of the video.
Thank you. And there's another one, which is, do sunflowers get stronger if they exercise?
I like to think so. Imagine a lazy sunflower. It wouldn't, it wouldn't survive very well, I don't think, but good question.
Okay. And that's it. You can go back for a little bit before more questions start pouring in.
Okay, great. I'm glad you guys are asking questions though. It means that you're listening. No one's zoned out yet. So taking this one step further, this bit, I want you to take the next slide with a pinch of salt, and you're going to have a lot of questions about this. So prepare yourselves, because I don't know how much of this I fully believe. There's definitely there's some reviewing to do. There is a lot more science that needs to go in behind this, because this is a little bit sci-fi. But if this is true, it's huge, and that is that plants can sense the shapes of those around them, and there are some species that can mimic those shapes. So this is the Bakila plant, and in 2016, Beluska and Mancuso produced this paper, and in it they showed the Bakila that does something that is very unique to this plant as far as we're aware. What it does is it grows next to a plant, and it mimics the shape of the plant that it is growing next to. And it's usually its host plant, and they think that it is a mechanism so that whatever would normally prey on it would mistake it for the plant that it's hosting on, and so it wouldn't then eat it. That's the suspicion. But if you look at these pictures now, so I've got an array of pictures in front of you. Where's my mouse gone again? Here it is. If you look at the array of pictures in front of you, these are all different species, all the way through to H. You can see V is the Bakila plant, T is the host plant, and you can see here, this is Bakila here, this is Bakila here, this is Bakila, and you can see that it's mimicking the tip here. On this one, you can see it's mimicking this shape, this short, this squat leaf shape. You've got down here, this one has got some serration around the edge, and you can see this is the Bakila here trying to produce a serration on its edge. This one's really wild. You've got this one's very heavily serrated. You can see it's like a mint leaf shape, and you can see here it's produced some really pretty heavy serrations to try and mimic this shape. And we don't know how it does that, because it doesn't even have to be touching the host to do that. So it's not that it's chemically sensing. I mean, it could be in part that it's close enough to be chemically sensing the plant that it's growing next to, but you can put it in the same vicinity as a plant that it would host, that it is a natural host of it, and it will copy the shape of the host plant. And that raised a lot of questions. How are they doing this? How does this work? And essentially what Beluska and Mancuso said was this, and I will just let you take this in for a minute before I talk you through it, because it is a lot. But what you're looking at here is the shape of a leaf being compared to the shape of the eye. So looking at these two next to each other, I mean, I'm showing you next to a human eye. I used this because I did this talk with the sixth formers, and they hadn't seen anything beyond a human eye. There are composite eyes in insects that are much simpler and look much more like this. This is obviously a bit more of a complex system, but the premise is still the same, that there is a cuticle, the light comes in through the cuticle, the epidermis acts as a magnifier, that there are some receptors in the chloroplast or in the mesophyll layer. This is the spongy mesophyll. In the mesophyll layer, these are the cells, and in here there would be some form of receptor that can take the information in and turn this into a chemical response. And it's very similar to the light coming in through the cornea, being directed by the lens onto the back of the eye where there's the focal point. A composite eye is actually very similar in that the three bits that matter are the cornea-like region, the lens, and then the retina. That is the premise for a basic eye, essentially. And if this is true, this is huge because it means that plants can see something about the shapes that are around them. We know they can see different colors of light. We know they can see the direction of light. If they can also see shapes, that means that they are more aware of their environment than we think they are. So perhaps they can see their predators. It raises so many more questions than it answers.
Just a question come in on the, I think it was Bocilla. What does it look like when it's growing on its own?
Oh, a great question. I don't know, actually. It's really hard to identify it when it's growing out in the wild naturally, because it looks like so many other things. But it is it's a vine plant, and I think it's just got quite normal sort of these kind of oblongish type leaves. They're I was going to say if I told you to draw a leaf, but then you'd probably do this sort of shape. It's more of just like an oblong on a vine, and then they change themselves into more pointed or stubby shapes depending on what's around them. But it's definitely something that you'll have to Google. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure, but I think from what I remember, it's more of just like a plain oblong leaf. But they are very difficult to ID in the wild because they look so different depending on what they're growing on. But if they are on their host, then that is a good sign that it is a Bacilla plant.
And the other question that came in, is it then detecting the shape of the shadow of leaves above it? From George.
Oh, great question. I don't know what it is that they're sensing. The paper didn't point to anything in particular, whether it was that it was, as you say, the shadow, if it's that the plant is blocking it out. The trouble with shadows in something like a canopy is that they become very dull, and it requires sort of a direct backlight shining down on a leaf and then that falling perfectly onto a leaf. So I don't know. I think this is hugely under-researched. It's not something that seems to have been picked up with any real gusto in the scientific community. I wonder how many people know that this paper was published. I think it's definitely something that needs a little bit more input to find out sort of the validity of something like this. I think this is, if it's true, it's massive. Yeah, but it could be shadows. We just don't know. I think there's also, I remember reading Arabidopsis can recognize the form of its neighbors. But again, how it does that, whether that be the shadow or the actual shape of the neighbor, I don't know. We'll have to see.
And there's a couple of others which are going even deeper into it. Is it dynamic? So if you move the plant, and this is from George again, does the shape of the existing leaves change?
I don't know. So this is that there's not enough research for this. That would be a great PhD if you'd like to write it up and submit it to a university.
And the other one is, if they can perceive the shape of the host at all, how do they process it? Is there some sort of central nervous system, or how would they recognize and replicate the shape?
Another great question. You guys are on it this evening. In terms of processing the shape, so plants obviously don't have a brain, but they have quite a sophisticated network of hormones. In fact, they produce many of the same neuronal. I don't know human terms. I'm going to say neuronal hormones. Is that right? Brain hormones, brain chemicals. They produce a lot of the same brain chemicals as we do. So whether what they do is they then process that information in some way and produce the similar chemicals, and then those go to the different areas of the leaf. So like there's a certain chemical then goes to the peripheral area, and that causes the bunching, and then this is all conjecture, by the way, and then they send another chemical to the tip of the leaf, and that causes it to become a point. It sounds like a long way to go to have this behavior, but evolution does some crazy things. So honestly, anything can be true. Yeah. Do we?
And one more, which is more relevant to tomorrow, and I'll explain that later. How do we know they aren't everywhere watching and waiting?
I think they are. My dad always says never trust a vegetable, and I absolutely believe that to be Bible, you know? So we don't know how much they know, and I think this talk is only the ice tip of how much we don't know. There is so much more that follows this. Yeah, and this all asks more questions that just haven't been answered, because I think plants are hugely underrated for what they're actually capable of doing. So yeah, it is a little bit Day of the Triffids, I think.
That's all of them for now.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to go back to something a bit more familiar now. This is the Venus flytrap. You probably all stuck your finger in one at a gift shop or at a botanic garden. I had one as a child, and I closed all of the little traps and it died because that's what children do. So this is a great plant. It's great fun for kids. It's carnivorous, so it grows in nitrogen poor soils, and in order to get nitrogen, it eats things like flies and insects so that then it can gain that. And I want you to watch this video of how it works first before I go on with the talk, because I want you to take note of something. Oh, not this. If I go from, yeah, from this one. So a fly is going to land on this one. It's going to have a bit of a wander. I want you to see if you can see any difference between the first fly that gets caught and then the second one that gets caught, because one of them comes and it leaves and nothing happens. So I want you to think about maybe why that might be. Where's my mouse gone again? Here we go. So you can see this guy, he's just having a little mosey around. That one's been caught immediately. This guy's still taking his time. He's teasing us now. There you go. And then he's finally been caught. So I just want you to think maybe for a second, some of you might know the answer to this. I want you to think for a minute maybe about why it is that the first fly got eaten immediately and the second fly didn't.
While people are just thinking, just a quick question. Should you not close all the traps then? That's from Sarah.
Oh yeah, no, don't do that. I mean, it's not terrible, but it does cost the plant a lot of energy. So it is a good way to kill your Venus flytrap quickly. It's just a pro tip.
And we've got a suggested answer from George, which is, was it not hungry?
That's a great question. It was hungry, as we could see eventually. Maybe not the right time for it to eat. No. So what it is the, if you can, I don't know how well you can see this screen. On this fly trap here, you can see these two little hairs, hopefully. So there are actually lots of these little hairs, but these are the two that are very obvious on this one. And I'm going to use this leaf as an example. So when a fly lands on the inside of a leaf, it will touch one of these hairs. Plants have a timer in them, so we know plants can sense short bursts of time because it touching this leaf, this hair, sorry, won't do anything, but the plant is ticking away in its little plant not brain. If the fly touches this hair within a certain amount of time, then the trap will close. And the reason that this is set up is so that if something like a leaf lands on the fly trap, it won't just close on a leaf. It needs to know that something is alive and moving around on its leaf surface for it to close. It's a really clever way to make sure that it doesn't waste its energy closing on things like leaf and detritus that land inside the leaf. So then it has a couple of phases. So if it closes and there's nothing in it, then it will open back up again after a certain amount of time. But if it closes and it can sense that something's in there because the thing is still moving and setting off hairs as it tries desperately to escape, it closes fully and then the lips go backwards on themselves. So you can see this one's only just closed, so you don't have that ridge, but here you can see this ridge here. And what happens is that the leaf goes back on itself and that forces a really tight seal so that then the fly really can't escape. And then it produces all these digestive juices, and I think it's the same digestive juices that we produce. So it really is just, this is like a little stomach now on this plant. So why have I brought this one up? Well, this is a really good plant to introduce back to you my modeling. So it's a really great system. It's very well researched. So we know a lot about how it works. So when if you were to present this to me and I didn't know anything about it before, my first step as a computational plant scientist would be to model what this system entails. And it looks something like this. So this is a very nice, neat little model. So you have your trap open. There's mechanical stimulation, that's the leaf, that's the hair being triggered. There's an action potential in the leaf. So this is when the timer is going, because there's this action potential and it waits for a second trigger. And that second trigger produces a second action potential that pushes the charge accumulation above a set line. And it's that line that then causes the leaf to snap shut. So then you get, again, a lot of plants work in terms of movement, they work on cell turgidity. So the water transport pushes in, there's an influx of water and it forces the cells to go nice and firm, and that pushes the leaf together. It goes into, as I said, the semi-closed state. If there's something in it, it fully closes and digests. And then after a week, when it's done, it will open back up again. You will find that they do reopen once they're finished digesting. Otherwise, it has to wait to open back up again within half a day to a day, I would say. And this is why you don't want to close all of your fly traps, because if they are all closed for a whole day, that's a whole day that the plant isn't getting any nutrients, and that's not good. So if you do decide to buy a Venus flytrap, please don't kill it. Yeah, so this is a really nice simple model, and this is sort of the job that I have. I get given a model system and I produce something that goes like this, and from this you can then start to ask questions like, well, what kind of mechanical stimulation does it need? How big is the action potential? How much water is involved? Why does it take 12 hours to close? And you can do those empirically, but they are also questions that you can start to work out where the questions are. But there are a lot of systems where this is quite a quick system that you can deal with. You're only waiting a week for the leaf to open up again. But there are some systems where this threshold time is years, and you can't wait around years for something to happen so then you can test something else on it. And that's where computer simulations come in. So we're on the final straights here. We're on temperature now.
Just for a quick diversion, from Sarah again, are there any bits left after digestion, or is everything digested?
I think most things get digested. I think it's the only things that kind of tend to get left behind are bits of exoskeleton, because they're quite difficult to digest, but mostly they're really good. They just pour straight acid in, so they're really good at digesting as much as they can, because they are in really poor soil, so they have to do the best job that they can. Some of these plants, okay, this is an aside as well, sorry. Some of these plants can digest like whole birds, and then you just get things like beaks left over. It's crazy. Just look up, if you fancy a Google later, this guy was growing pitcher plants in his greenhouse, and a bluebird got in and yeah, fell in to one of his pitcher plants. So that can happen. Yeah, these are pretty bad plants. Yes, temperature.
Sorry, there's another one just before you move on.
Okay.
What would happen if you tried to opened one of the traps while it was digesting?
You probably get some acid spilt on yourself, so I would recommend that you wash your hands afterwards. If you forced it open, you would damage plants are quite delicate, so if you forced it open, you'd probably snap some of the cells, because when they're turgid, they become quite brittle. So you could tear some of the tissue and damage it quite badly. So it would continue to do. It probably wouldn't know that it'd been opened, so it would continue to digest and everything as much as it could, but it would probably then die away because of the damage. So I don't know that it would be particularly fruitful doing something like that. Are there any other questions?
No, you've got a few minutes before the next wave start pouring in.
Okay, so this is my plant. This is Ationum arabicum. This is stonecress, and we've been looking at temperature and the sensing of temperature in the behaviour of this plant. So apologies for the next couple of slides. The pictures are now in review with the paper, so I can't show them to you until after that's been published. So watch this space and you'll get to see the actual pictures that go with it. So for the time being, we're going to have to deal with these ones, unfortunately. But this picture is from the last paper that we published on this plant. Arshad et al. This is where I am in the paper. I'm about 3 or 4 down the line. So this is Ationum arabicum. It grows in the Anatolian mountains in Turkey. The habitat it lives in is something like this. So a mountainous habitat where it's very stony and exposed, and it's steppe habitat, so there's lots of water runoff. The environment is very harsh. It doesn't have great nutrient source. It doesn't have great access to groundwater, versus its other choice of habitat, which is down here in what we call subhabitat 2, which is this lush foliage. So it's very overcrowded, it's overshadowed, it's much more nutrient rich, but the competition is much higher. So this is kind of its choice. Both of them require either that you become a very good competitor or something that can steal nutrients off something else, or it lives up here where it's reliant on the environment being really good that year, but sometimes the environment isn't great. So it's a pretty rough place to try and grow as a plant, essentially. But what's really great about this plant is that this plant, like many other plants, is undergoes what's called heteromorphism. And what this means is that it produces two kinds of fruit and two kinds of seeds. So these seeds that you can see up here, these are called dehiscent seeds, and they are the bigger of the two seeds. Sorry, these are the fruits. Sorry, the dehiscent fruits. These are the bigger of the two fruits. What they do is they dehisce, so they break apart in the middle, and they drop 4, 5, 6 seeds into the surrounding environment, and these seeds don't disperse. I'll put this word diaspore here on the page. That just means the bit of the plant that does the dispersing. So in the dehiscent fruit, the bit that does the dispersing is the seeds, and these seeds have a mucus layer on them, and it helps them stick to the soil so they don't get then like washed away. So they land, they stick to the soil, and they germinate. So they undergo local dispersal. The indehiscent fruits are these little ones at the bottom. They are much smaller in size, and they only have one seed per fruit. They have these little wings on them, so they can undergo wing dispersal, and they are also buoyant in water. So unlike these ones that stick to the soil, if there is rain and runoff, then they can float in that, and then they can be dispersed down the mountain. The wind dispersal allows them to be dispersed in essentially any direction. So the diaspora in this example is the seed in the fruit coat, and it's that bit that germinates as a whole. So these ones land in the soil and then they germinate. These ones disperse off and they germinate within their seed coat, fruit coat. And I'm running out of gin. Okay. So what's really cool about this plant, apart from it being able to do heteromorphism, is that the ratio of the two fruit types grow depending on the temperature that you grow it at. So if you grow it at a lower temperature, it produces a higher ratio of these dispersing seeds. If you grow it at a higher temperature, it produces a higher ratio of these non-dispersing seeds. What's more amazing than that even is that it's carried on a generation, so it will produce a different ratio depending on the environment that its grandma grew up in. So there's some carriage of knowledge somewhere in the genome that we're not sure about. This is a new area. I'm part of the Seed Adapt team that spans here and Germany, and we're working to work out what this plant is doing, essentially. Got a whole team of us looking at it. And we're hoping that this might be another model system to go alongside something like Ationema, because it allows us to look further at some of the things that it can do that Ationema can't do. So we know it's got this temperature difference. We know it grows in these two, for simplicity's sake, two subhabitats. And we know it's got these two seed types, and we know it senses temperature. So what the paper that I have just written that is currently in review looks at, again, this is a prototype of the picture that is now in the submitted paper. So if it doesn't quite work, it's because this isn't the final image. This is the one that got vetoed, but we'll go with it for a minute. So there are 2 subhabitats. My job was then to describe that whole behavior in a mathematical model and then use a computer simulation to determine how it would be able to evolve in an environment where neither subhabitat is ideal, but it needs to be able to kind of juggle between the two. So you can see here there's 2 populations, one in subhabitat 1, one in subhabitat 2. They both produce a number of seeds. So in both examples, in subhabitat 2, we decided to say that the environment was fairly constant. And in this one, we decided to say that the subhabitat is fluctuating. And it's fluctuating on 2 counts. The number of times it experiences good years over the whole total number of simulations, and how bad the bad years were. So what this means is how badly fecundity is affected by bad years, how fewer seeds it produces in bad years. Hello, James.
Yep. We've got a couple of questions coming in. One is, are we pausing for a few minutes to clap at 8 o'clock? I would say yes, because I know otherwise we'll lose everyone and it will break it up anyway. So if we stop for a couple of minutes at 8, the other one is one I'm fascinated to hear the answer to.
Okay.
Which is the transmission of information down the generations likely to be due to epigenetics? And that's from Avril.
I love that question. It's something I wish I studied, and I'll try and keep my answer short because I know that we're close to 8 o'clock. I don't know. Our team doesn't know at the moment. Genetics is something that we really want to get involved in and understand. We don't have anybody who is specifically genetics minded at the moment. So I think that is something that we would have to bring in a postdoc or another PhD student to investigate that. Epigenetics is not something that I know like very much about. I'm more of the ecology conservation side of botany, and I'm just dipping my toes into computational simulation. So this is kind of my niche. But yeah, I think we would love to know if epigenetics are involved. I suspect that would make the most sense for how the information is able to be carried on an extra generation. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, if you want to write a proposal for a PhD, that's what I'm going to keep saying to you. If you want to write a proposal for a PhD, my lab is currently hiring. So yeah.
Okay. Are you okay to carry on after the clap?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Shall we take a break for 5 minutes to let people clap and let you refill your gin?
Yeah.
And if everyone comes back in a few minutes, if you'd like to carry on then.
Yeah, great.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
you may be giving some of our participants nightmares. I know a couple of them. I know where the if you pried it open while digesting one came from, and yeah, that's going to be something that comes back to haunt some people in the audience.
Yeah, that's what I like to do. Leave people with nightmares. It's my job as a botanist, to make people feel like they're very much in a Day of the Triffids type environment.
The Triffids, though, they weren't particularly outlandish, if I remember. I mean, yes, they were fast, but it was basically snatching vines and then dissolving.
Yeah, essentially, but they could talk to each other as well. They had those like 3 thingies that they.
Oh, with the clattering, yes.
Yeah, like they were chatting and running.
Yeah, and of course the film was only picked up from where the book was about a third of the way in.
Oh, have you read the book?
Yes, yeah, the book had them as crops that we were growing to start with.
And then there was the meteor shower, and then the guy. Oh, love
Yeah.
it.
Although in one of the variants, it was the meteor shower was human-made satellites coming down, so it was all our fault, completely our fault.
I like the idea that the meteors were made by the Triffids to make everyone go blind, because then that adds a whole extra level to how smart the Triffids were. And I'm on Team Triffid.
I'm not sure I can bring myself to be on Team Plants.
I haven't done my job.
Oh no, we've got people cheering for Team Triffid. We've got someone saying can't ever look up at Starlink again, just in case.
Love it. Yeah, I also just want to say, if anybody is working for the NHS out of you guys, thanks very much. Or just doing anything that kind of related, thank you very much for going out and doing your job. It's great. It's very helpful. Need a little bit of cheer right now. Thanks very much. It was wild though on my street. Someone was letting off fireworks. A dog started barking. I don't know if you guys heard of any of that.
We've got pots and pans being banged together, and we've not had fireworks yet, which is unusual. Usually we get a lot of fireworks with absolutely any excuse. So, Resham, the reason for the clapping is that, sorry, I've just been asked for the background of it.
Oh, no problem.
It's because it's a sort of thank you to the NHS for continuing to do their jobs at the moment and continuing to work to save lives right now. So it's just something to honour them on, well, every Thursday at 8 o'clock. So hopefully that answers your question. But yeah, it is just a commemoration. It's what we can do at the moment, which frankly isn't much, but it's something. And I have heard various people from the NHS saying it does make a difference to them.
To boost morale, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Is everybody back by now? Shall we?
I think we can probably, I mean, if people want to put their hands up if they're not back. Yeah, I think we've got enough to carry on.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I didn't realize this would go over an hour, but I think it's because we're dispersing the questions in between. So I'll just carry on as normal. But yeah, just put your hand up if you guys are starting to get like plant overload. Okay, so we've had our two subhabitats. One of them produces different seed numbers depending on whether it experiences bad years or not, and it sometimes produces more bad years than others. The other environment is quite constant, but the fecundity of this environment is just generally lower. So then a number of these, so then then this is where the model starts to branch off. So this is just a set number of seeds. The number of, this can be broken up into 2 different branches. So the seeds that disperse and then seeds that don't disperse. So seeds that don't disperse just end up back in the population in the following year. The seeds that do disperse do one of 3 things. Either they successfully disperse into the other environment, they die en route, or they try to disperse but fail and end up back in the environment that they came from. And this applies to both sides. So that's what I managed to boil the behavior down to. And I turned this into a matrix multiplication, ran this over like 100 years. So this is a year. I assumed that this is an annual species, so it dies at the end of the year. So the population is just made up of the offspring from the previous generation. And then what I was able to do was map the growth rate of the population depending on the frequency and how bad the badges are that I set in my simulation, and then look at the population change. And essentially what this boiled down to, oh, it's not telling me. Well, essentially what this boiled down to was the only way that this works is if the plant is able to sense the environment that it is in. So if you take sensing out of the equation and it is only reliant on the information it's got from its subhabitat, it will always choose to stay where it is because it doesn't know that what it's going to experience if it leaves is going to be any better than where it is. But if it has sensing, and then it kind of has some information about where it is, if it evolves between environments that are different enough in temperature change, so in this example with Astyonema, if it can determine which environment it's in a bad year, it can say, oh, it's bad here, but at least if I disperse some of my seeds out, then I've got a better chance of surviving than if I just stay here and potentially die. So then what this plant is able to do is it's able to juggle its population between several poor subhabitats. And this is something that's not just seen in Astyonema arabicum, so that's this plant that we've got here, but it's something that's seen across the kingdoms. So this is Poa alpina. This is an alpine grass, and what it does is at higher altitudes it produces dispersing offspring, and at lower altitudes it produces offspring by asexual reproduction, by producing by propagation. So again, sensing where it is in the environment and then either dispersing or not dispersing. And the environment that it persists in is again very variable. Corals do something similar. They either produce far dispersing or near dispersing offspring based on current changes, water temperature, that sort of thing. We've got the side-blotched lizard here. These are really cool. What they do is the maternal lizard will live in an environment depending on how the environment was, kind of from what it takes in. It will determine whether it would prefer to produce more dispersing or non-dispersing offspring. So if it grew up in an area that was quite nice, it will produce fewer dispersing offspring than if it grows up somewhere that is a bit more variable and not such a great place to grow up. Aphids as well. They don't do this based on temperature, they do this based on touch. So if an aphid is on a plant and it bumps into more aphids in its lifetime, it will produce more offspring that have wings. So they can disperse off because it knows that the population density is quite high because it's bumped into lots of other aphids, which I think is a pretty cool, it's a pretty cool way to make that kind of decision. But then, you know, how much have you got if you're an aphid? just bumping into each other all the time, then that is going to be a great indicator of what kind of environment you're living in. Yeah,
So we've just had a couple of things. One from Kat is plants aren't able to imagine things then yet that we know of.
Oh, I don't know about imagining.
And the other one is to say that someone's going to have nightmares about sentient aphids, and they wanted to say a personal thank you for that.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome. I think the more you know about nature, the more freaked out you get by it. I think it's a bit of a blessing and a curse being a biologist. You get to know some pretty interesting things, but they do tend to then become vivid imagining. So, but no, plants imagining things. I love that idea. I don't know how sentient they are, and I suppose we won't know for another couple of generations. But I think they do have quite a bit more understanding than we think they do. So why is this important? Well, if we come back to everything I've talked about, the biggest threats to many of these species, the ones that I've spoken to you about, and especially the ones that I've brought up in my paper, they are hugely threatened by things like climate changes and increase of variable environments. And how they interact with their environment is still hugely unknown. So it's been stated by many different plant scientists that they're hugely undervalued, they're hugely underrated, and they are often mistakenly removed from papers and research to do with their interactions with the environment and with sensing, because people just assume that they are very still, very passive organisms that are just having life happen to them, when in fact they're interacting a lot more with their environment than we think. They can take in a lot more information about their environment than we think. And in some ways they're not as sophisticated in the way that we imagine sophistication, but they have some sophistication about them that makes them as aware and a part of the environment as anything else. So it's really important to make sure that we don't take them for granted, or we don't ignore them from specific areas of research just because we think that it doesn't apply to them. You never know if it is going to apply to them. So if you are someone who works with animals or anywhere else in sort of the biological area, maybe think perhaps this research could impact plants as well. In the same way that when I do research, I think, I wonder if there's an animal that does this, because oftentimes they behave very similarly to each other. Evolution is complicated, but actually when you think about it, it's not that complicated at all. Most of the time, it finds the same way to do something. A different way to do the same thing. So that's kind of the take-home message of my paper, and also of this talk, is that yes, these are these are mammalian sensing, but they're also plant sensing in a way. And you might not immediately think of them when you hear of these 5 things, but plants are able to do something like each of the different things that we classically think are anthropomorphic senses.
Here we go. Here's one for you. Getting into philosophy. From George. Can you draw a line between actual senses and chemical pathways that just mimic senses?
Are senses not chemical pathways? Are you talking about I would argue that all sensing is chemical. I would argue that everything is chemical pathways, to be fair, what it boils down to. I'm not sure I quite understand the question, if there's any clarification behind it.
George, if you stick your hand up, I can unmute you and let you ask a bit more detail if you'd like to.
Hi, George.
Hello. Yeah, I suppose what I'm saying is that is it just something going on that is it a behavior that's just a bit like one of our senses, or is it an actual sense that a plant has? I think a lot of these things, they behave a bit like our senses, but are they really? Is it really a sense of smell? Is it really a sense of touch, or is it just chemistry going on that makes the plant behave as if it had a sense of touch?
I see.
Yeah, just kind of understand the difference between really having one of these senses, like really being able to see, and just behaving as if it could see.
Yeah, I think obviously we're talking on a very on a much more simplistic level. It's perhaps better to compare plants to something more like an invertebrate or something where the level of sensing is obviously to a much reduced state. But ultimately, sensing across the board is an input into, when you break it down to what actually is a sense, is an input into a sensor, a chemical pathway through a neuronal system or some system, and then a response. That's generally kind of how we define a sense. So in one way, yes, they're sensing in the same way, in that they take in a stimulus, they have a pathway through their being, and they respond to the sense in one way or another. So when you really break it down, these are actual senses. Of course, the way that we do things is on a very complicated level, but the underlying biology and chemistry behind it is essentially the same thing. If that answers.
Does that answer your question, George?
Yes, I think so. Thank you.
Thank you.
So,
sorry, I've more
yeah.
people have thrown in questions in the during that. So going back to the caterpillar, I think you said that the plant reacted to the same vibrations as the caterpillar made when eating the plant, but would it react to something else eating the plant but not making those vibrations? Does it feel itself being eaten?
Yes. Essentially. So the problem with hearing and touch, again, this is where, so we think of these as typically the five senses, because this is how we experience the world. Smell and taste, as I've said, are very synonymous in that they're both a chemical stimulus causing a response. Hearing and touch, again, both rely on mechanical vibrations. So if you play the sound to the plant or you vibrate the plant in the same way, and it will have the same response. So it is the vibrations. In the same way that if you hear a really loud sound, you can feel it as well. You can feel vibrations. It's a similar thing. So yeah, they can feel and hear themselves being eaten, if that makes you feel any better.
There we go on the first two. And one more question, this one from George. Your first slide included a sense of foreboding. Is that a joke?
Yes, I really hoped someone would notice that one. Yeah, I just have a terrible sense of humour, so that one's in there. No one picked that up from the last talk.
Okay, that's all the questions for now. You can.
So actually, on that note, that is the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that I have conveyed in some way that the sort of similarities between plants and mammalian sensing, and I hope that I've convinced you that plants are actually pretty cool in what they're able to do. If you did like this talk and you want to hear more from me, I'm quite vocal on Twitter, as I'm sure James can tell you. And I also have got my blog, which I've just started up. So if you happen to want to look at that and you find anything interesting, or if you want to give me any feedback on it, I'm in my early days of science communication, so I would be happy to take any constructive criticism. So yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, so before we let you go, I'm sure there will be more questions turning up while I talk, and there's a couple already coming in, but I just want to say thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you for putting up with all of the questions and interruptions and answering them so well. And there's one I really want to hear an answer for. In light of all this, and this is from George again, is tree hugging a safe activity?
I don't know what trees make of tree hugging. I'm still going to continue to hug trees. There's like the psychological research behind how that's good for us. And I'd like to think that trees enjoy it too. So I'm going to suggest that if you're like me and you like a good tree hug, then you go.
Okay. And if you're happy to stick around for a bit, I'm sure more questions will come in, and I'll just do a quick sum up now. So for those of you where this is your first event, I hope you've enjoyed it. Feel free to follow us and come to more. We've got a couple more coming up, one going in completely the opposite direction next week on the psychology of technology. So the opposite of the intuitive senses of plants, and more the considered psychology of electronics. And then we've got one on microwaves, mobile masts, and I forget what the third bit was, possibly radar. But that one will be the week after, and our first one for May, and we will be announcing more soon. We're also appropriately doing a bit of a special surprise thing tomorrow, or not much of a surprise, which is a Café Fantastique. And just to be clear, Café Scientifique is a very distributed movement. There is no central governance. There is no central set of rules. So this was a unanimous decision by Cyber Café Scientifique to have a bit of light-hearted counterpoint to our presentations. So tomorrow we will be showing the Thing from Another World, the original 1951 version, which is about a evil plant monster which feeds on human blood. So you can see the clear connection there. If you'd like to join that, it will be at 8 p.m. tomorrow. If you do have any questions for Bethany, please drop them in the Q&A now or in the chat, and we'll keep her here for a little while to answer them, and then I think we can let everyone go, and I will get back to my botanical run.
Perfect.
Okay. Was Prince Charles right to talk to his plants?
Oh, absolutely. So there's so much research that I could throw at you right now. So there are plants that have been shown to grow better if you play like Mozart to them. There are some plants that respond really well to metal music. Playing music to plants has generally shown positive response. So if you have got a greenhouse and you want to set up a boombox in there or something, then I'm sure they'll absolutely love it. Yeah, plants seem to like sounds, so.
Okay, and we've not got any other questions come in so far, but there we go. Can I play cabbage white music to get my cabbages to activate their defense mechanism?
Cabbage white music? You mean as in the butterfly?
I'm assuming the butterfly, or it must start as a caterpillar. Whatever eats the cabbages, I think is the question here.
So this is also an aside. Cabbage whites apparently. So my parents have just gone into retirement, and they are now part of the butterfly conservation program in the UK. But cabbage whites aren't a species. I didn't know this. They're actually white butterflies. There's actually like 3 or 4 different species of white butterfly, and they're mistakenly called cabbage whites. And apparently butterfly biologists hate that because that's not a thing. So yeah, just a pro tip for if you want to really annoy a butterfly scientist. what would they be called? A lepidopterologist?
I think something like that. Yeah, they're the ones with jars and nets, aren't they? Um, right. Why would plants like sound?
I don't know. I've never asked one. I can imagine that they're used to being in an environment where they are exposed to lots of different sounds, and they're used to having wind blow through them, and they experience different weathers. So when you bring them indoors, I suppose it's a very unnatural environment. So perhaps it mimics in some way them being in a more natural environment by having sounds come past them. Again, conjecture.
So what you're saying is that most music is roughly equivalent to a load of breezy air. Couple of other sound-based ones, which I think I can link these two together from Becca and Kat. Do other plants nearby react to the sound of their neighbours screaming whilst being eaten? And if a tree falls in the forest, do the other plants hear it? Have we finally answered that question?
Your questions are great, guys. Yes to the first one. I think there is some suggestion. I don't know if there's been research done on this. I'd have to look it up. I think there's some research that has been done into the reason that they produce this scream, or if other plants can sense this scream around them, that they start then putting their own defense mechanisms up. So they start producing these chemicals. So you know the really bitter taste that kids often hate in things like Brussels sprouts? It's that same chemical that gets produced when a plant's being eaten by, well, especially anything from the Brassica family, as Arabidopsis is. It produces this sort of bitter, and it's in high doses, it's very toxic to caterpillars. So if we eat a cabbage, obviously it's fine, but if a caterpillar ate a whole cabbage, it would be very unwell, for many reasons, but one of them being that the chemicals that they produce are toxic to them. So by screaming, it's letting everything else around it know.
So does that mean the very hungry caterpillar lied to me?
I'm not going to ruin anyone's childhood tonight. And falling in the forest, that is my favorite thing so far. Yes, probably. And that is very sad. Imagine being a tree and just hearing your friend fall and not being able to do anything about it. That's devastating.
On that traumatic note, we've run out of questions. Other than now, I am sad for the trees.
Oh no.
Oh wait, we've got another one. So the 5 senses are pretty universal amongst animals, but the senses in plants seem to be quite species specific. Is it right, therefore, to call them senses?
Ooh, a good question. So there's still senses. The thing with plants is they're so under researched. I'm giving you species specific examples of each of them. Usually unanimously, plants can sense light in one form or another. So they can definitely take light in and respond to it, which is typically what we refer to as vision, but is obviously not vision in the same way. This is just light response. So that one's pretty unanimous. Touch is another one that most plants respond to touch and vibration, and also to chemicals as well. So there's sort of a couple of basic ones that we just tend to, as botanists, we tend to just assume that they can do. The trouble is, plants are so under researched, we don't know how many of them any of these things relate to. So I've given you species specific ones. There are many thousands of plants, and we know so little about what their structures are for and how they're responding to their environment that I can't say that your plant isn't listening to you right now if you have one in your room with you, because there are so many that have just kind of gone under research. So We can still call them sensors. It's still an input of stimulus and a response. But can I say that all plants can see? No, absolutely not. That's not what I'm trying to say with this talk. What I'm trying to say is plants are very in tune with their environments, and a lot of them are able to do some really cool things with that. And so we can't underestimate what they're capable of, basically.
Okay, I think we'll make this the last one because we've dragged you into an unexpected marathon session here, and it's now 8:30. But are there plants that react to different light wavelengths or can only see specific light wavelengths that we can't see, UV or IR? I know some plants use colours in flowers that humans can't see, but that insects or other animals can. And actually, I've kept bees. I know that some plants use some form of magnetism as well.
Yes, plants can detect. So can they detect light that we can't? Yes. Plants can see infrared and UV, and they can respond differently to infrared and UV. So there's been research about them producing different chemical responses to those, just defense mechanisms, growth patterns changing in response to those things. So yeah, their response to light, I think because light is, of all the things a plant is going to experience, light is the main one because that's how it eats. So it makes sense that a plant is able to have a much finer tune in terms of light than anything else.
Thank you. And again, yeah, just really thank you. I will say to everyone in the audience, all of our speakers are volunteers. We do run free events, so we're not bribing Bethany to be here, but I think it's been a fantastic talk. If you rapidly click and unclick the raise hand button, it does look a little like applause. And also, obviously, the blog address is there, Twitter is there. If you've enjoyed it, just send a thank you on Twitter and read the blog as well. It's fascinating, and daisies are not flowers.
Say no more.
I won't spoil the rest for you. As I said, tomorrow we'll be doing the thing from another world. I'll have more details up about that on the various social media sites, so mainly Facebook and Twitter. And if you've got friends or family or anyone, particularly someone you want to give nightmares about plants who might enjoy this talk, then it will be up on our Facebook page, on our website. It will eventually be up on YouTube, but I failed to get that working quite in time. So currently it's missing the first 10 minutes. That will be up properly later on. And thank you all for coming.
And thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely fine. Enjoy the gin. Like I said, I'm going off to drink something botanical myself. So I will end this in a minute once we've had the chorus of thank yous pass through the chat. But I think it would be safe to say that everyone seems to have enjoyed it. So yes, thank you again, and I'm going to end this now.
Right. See you later.
Bye.